Now I have this AMT 1/25th scale dump truck kit, and I've decided I'm going to convert it into a garbage truck. This will involve quite a bit of kit bashing and scratch building, but that's all part of the fun. Now, this is by no means a great kit. For one thing, most of the parts are not numbered, which is mildly frustrating, but also not really a big deal for me since I don't plan to follow the instructions anyway. Now, one of the first things I can tell from a quick look at the box art is that the rear axle is going to have to be moved farther to the rear. This was easily accomplished by first measuring and marking where I needed to drill the holes and making sure they lined up. Once I was satisfied with the positioning, I started drilling. Then I added the dualies, and with a little bit of effort, I got the wheels on. And around this point, I realized I was also going to have to extend the chassis. To make the extension, my first step was to cut 2 pieces of styrene to the size and shape that I wanted, and then added right-angled pieces that would function as tabs. Over the course of this build, I found these angled pieces to be incredibly useful. I will be using this technique a lot over the course of this build. I use these tabs to attach the angled back end. I didn't like the air brake chambers that came with this kit, so I decided to make new ones. To do this, I took 2 return rollers from a 1/35th scale Sherman tank, and then glued a piece of plastic to the top, and then attached it to the back of the dualies. It wasn't really much, but it was definitely an improvement on what came with the kit. The steps were a little too smooth for my tastes, and looked like a safety hazard, so I superglued some steel mesh that I'd cut to shape, and then attached the steps to the fuel tanks. Now at around this point, I decided that I didn't like the exhaust that came with the kit, so I made one out of brass and decided I'd pretend the right fuel tank was a misshapen muffler. I know it's all wrong, but this is my truck, and I'm making up the rules as I go along. Anyway, I cut some brass tube, soldered it off camera, and then drilled a hole where it was going to go. When that hole wasn't big enough, I used a screw. It may look like butchery, but it worked, and I was happy with my new exhaust. I'll worry about the heat shield later. Up next came the hydraulic tank. There was one in the kit, but it was not what I had in mind, and instead, I chose to model it after one that I saw on a real garbage truck. At first, I felt a little daunted by the irregular shape, but once I had a plan, everything started to come together. I started by gluing the top and bottom pieces at a right angle, and then I attached the sides. Now at first my plan was to construct the tank using flat pieces, and then form the curves by wrapping a panel of 20 thou styrene to form the body. I started by pre-bending the plastic at the points where the bends were going to be. Then I cemented the bottom and wrapped the plastic around the front in stages, allowing the adhesive to cure between bends. Then I attached bits to the front to represent the pump and the filters, and on the sides I added the valves for draining the air tank. I used the air tank that came with the kit. The only change I made was to drill 2 holes to allow me to attach a pair of air lines to the tank. Now it was time to add the tanks. First, I attached the hydraulics, and then the air tank with the 2 air lines being inserted into holes that I drilled at the back of the hydraulic tank. Then, I threw together a battery box, using a part from the kit along with a few odds and ends of styrene, and then attached that to the chassis, just forward of the hydraulic tank. At this stage, I felt like I had a good opportunity to take a step back and look at the progress thus far and plan my next steps. After sketching in the layout, I cut a few pieces of pink foam to lay down the contours and glued them to the board, starting with the road, then the shoulders, and after that, the driveways. You can see here that I got the most out of my glue bottle by cutting it in half and scooping out what's inside. It's messy, but it works. Once the first layer of foam was down, I started carving out a ditch. These can be seen alongside country roads anywhere you go, and they will feature prominently in this diorama. I used a couple pieces of brass pipe to make the culverts. Unfortunately, I didn't have any corrugated pipes on hand, but luckily that won't be a major problem since I plan to cover that up later on. Anyway, after I added a second layer of foam, I started carving out the shape of the ditch. Once that was done, I used some air-dried polymer clay to cover up the top of the pipes. I had deliberately chosen to use one pipe with a slightly larger diameter because I wanted to have a bump in the driveway over the culvert, which you sometimes see. I then used some more polymer clay to line the bottom of the ditch. Now it was time to glue on sheets of cork where the roads and driveways were going to be. As with the foam, I laid down the cork in 2 layers. The most frustrating part was gluing cork over the driveway with the hump. Luckily, I was able to wrestle it into place with the help of some clamps. For the second layer, I tried a different approach. First, I soaked the cork overnight in water with just a drop of fabric softener. Then, the next morning, I held it under an iron for a minute or so. Then, while it was still hot, I clamped everything into place. When I removed the clamps, I found that cracks had formed, a piece of cork had been torn off, and the wood that I used to hold the cork in place had left an impression in the softer cork. Now normally this wouldn't be ideal, but I was able to work with this because the driveway that I was basing it on was in pretty rough shape to begin with. Now that all the pavement had been laid down, it was time to roughen it up a little. So with a sculpting tool, I chipped off the edges. After that, I added some drywall mud to the seams to try and smooth over the gap a little. And after that was done, I spent a few hours making cracks and potholes. A tedious task, but hopefully worth it. Next, I spray painted the chunks of cork that I chipped off the edge of the road and set them aside for later. Then, I spread celluclate over the ditches, the shoulders, and the front lawns. I embedded some of the chunks of cork that had been set aside in the celluclate by one of the driveways to simulate rocks. Once that was done, I patched up a few of the cracks and potholes with epoxy putty. Now that this project is off to a good start, I feel like this is a good point to finish part 1. In the next episode, I will show how I built the body of the truck, and I'll make a bit more progress on the terrain and vegetation. I hope you all enjoyed this, and I'll see you when I finish editing part 2.